friends, and welcome back. I'm Mrs. Gordon, and I am so glad you are here with me today to learn new things. We have been doing activities about sink and float, and we learned what those mean. Today, we're going to see different items if they sink or float when solutions are added to them. I have 4 cups of water, and then I have some little objects here. So if you can see if you can grab 4 cups of water and objects that you have that can sink or float, and let's test them out. Let's grab your materials and let's get started. In my 4 cups of water, there's different things. They may all look the same to you, but they are different. I have a cup of plain water, a cup of salt water, a cup of sugar water, and a cup of baking soda. Do not drink those. You can drink the plain water, but do not drink those. I have some little Lego hashtags. I'm going to test and see if these will sink and float in my different solutions. Remember, we always make a prediction. What do you think? Let's first make a prediction with our plain water. Do you think my hashtag Legos will sink or float? Let's put about 4 or 5 of them. These are going in the plain water. They all floated. They're just floating right at the top. Let's try our salt water. Do you think they will sink or float in salt water? Make sure you have your different solutions to make your prediction. I think these will float as well. Let's see. They all floated, but if you noticed, in the salt water, when I dropped them in there, they sank and bounced right back up. They're all floating, but at first they sank right into the water and then floated to the top. But our prediction is right. They're floating. Let's try in our sugar water. Do you predict they will sink or float? Let's see. All of my Lego hashtags are floating. These slightly sank into the water, but they're floating. The plain water is still floating. The salt water is still floating, and then the sugar water is still floating. Did you use a different object? Did it float or sink in your different solutions? Test out your predictions. Let's do our last cup of water with the baking soda. Do you predict these will sink or float? My prediction is they will float, but let's see what kind of activity will happen once I drop them in there. Did you see how it sank into the water, but it bounced right back up? It did the same reaction as the salt. It sank below the water, but then it floated right to the top. What object did you use? Did it sink or float? I also have some colored beads. Let's see how they will change in the water. Will some sink? Will some expand? Or will they float? Here is my plain water. Let's see what will take place. All of the colored beads sank to the bottom of the plain water. I don't see any of them trying to float. They sank. So my hashtag Lego blocks are floating to the top and the color beads sank to the bottom. Did you try something else new? Let's see what happens when I put some color beads in the salt water. I have most of them that sank, but I have one that's floating. So my hashtag Legos are floating with one of the colored beads, but the rest sank to the bottom. They also are slowly expanding. So this color bead sank to the bottom and one floated to the top. Let's try in our sugar water. What's your prediction? Will it sink or float? Ooh, I definitely have a mixed review. Some floated to the top and stayed with the hashtag Legos, and some are sank to the bottom. So we have half are sank and some are floating. Did you use another object to see if that prediction was a sink or float? So in our sugar water, we got half and half. Some sink and some floated. Let's try our last cup of water with the baking soda. What's your prediction? Will it sink or float? It looks like I have two that chose to float, and most of them sank to the bottom. Not as much as my sugar water. A lot of the beads chose to float, and most of them sank. The salt water, one bead was floating, and the rest sank to the bottom. And then baking soda, two are floating, and most of them sank to the bottom. In my plain water, all of the beads just sank to the bottom. Did you use two different objects? It looks like the hashtag Legos are floating across the board in the plain, salt, sugar, and baking soda. The color beads chose to sink. In the plain water, they sank to the bottom. In the salt water, most of them sank and one floated. In the sugar water, I had quite a few that floated, and then the ones that sank to the bottom. In the baking soda, two chose to float, and most of them sank to the bottom. Plain, salt, sugar, baking soda. Those are three different types of solutions you can test out along with your controlled, which is the plain water. So, what did you predict? What did you notice? What did you see? Did you use two different kinds of items? You can even try to use three. See what sinks and what floats. Next time you're with your nearest adult, see if they'll mix up some different cups of water for you. Maybe you can get colored beads or jewels so you can make predictions and see what sinks or floats. Until next time, I wish you well.